Hello, I'm Barbara Peters. Welcome to another episode of the Criminal Calendar. Lately, I've been doing a kind of sweepstakes to try to figure out which author wins the I came the most distance to talk to you on television. And Giles is not maybe right up there because Peter May was here from France and beat you out. But nevertheless, Giles Blunt has joined us from Toronto. Good thinking to come here in February.
Yes, it makes a nice change from Toronto, I'll tell you.
So, I was visiting your website today because last time I saw you, or the first time I met you, we were in New York.
That's right.
Where you lived for what, 22 years?
22 years, yep. And after the first 20 years, it really starts to get on your nerves. And we were thinking about getting out for a long time, and when our apartment was going to go co-op and cost a fortune, we thought, we can do better than that. And we moved to Toronto, and haven't looked back. It's been great up there.
I found an interesting little comment from you on your website, and I've given a lot of thought to this subject about how well do writers write if there's a distance between them and the place that they're writing about. And by distance, I could mean geographical, or I could sort of mean cultural. But you said there were some factors in your childhood that even though you grew up in North Bay, Ontario, you felt a bit like an outsider.
Yeah, it's a very Canadian place in that the lakes freeze solid in winter and you scrape them off and play hockey on them and stuff like that. And the population is, when I was growing up, it was about 30% French Canadian. Now it's probably closer to 45% French Canadian. But my home was very, very English. My parents emigrated to Canada after the war, and my brothers and sisters were all born in England. I was the only one born here, until we adopted a brother later on. So it was very odd to be in such an English home and then go out to this very, very Canadian place. I think of it as shuttle diplomacy between the two cultures. Because my parents, English people, once they leave England, they become more English than they ever were when they were in England. And that was certainly true of my parents.
You know, you are entirely right. I remember when Rob and I, we were addicted to cruising, wound up in the Falkland Islands as en route, you know, from Rio to Valparaiso or something. And I mean, I couldn't believe it. It was just as though we'd stepped into a rural English village.
It's like Somerset Maugham country or Paul Theroux country, you know. They're very good at describing English enclaves in Africa or Malaysia or wherever. The saying is that they're more English than the English, and it's completely true, because they hang on to a kind of frozen time. In my parents' case, it was wartime England. So, you know, shortages and mustn't grumble sort of Englishness.
Well, I've read Vicki Delaney's two books about, I think the first one in particular, where there was an English war bride who came to Canada and really had to struggle. She's an author that we published, had to struggle with her husband's family. But and his father's a psychopath, so it was a really dreadful thing for her. But the thing that's sort of hard to grasp reading today was the fact that she really was totally cut off. She couldn't. I mean, you could call maybe, but even phoning transatlantic in the late 1940s was a huge deal.
It would be a big deal. People would think somebody had died if you.
Well, and hugely expensive, and so the sense of isolation that this English woman had living in Canada, you can't imagine today when people are on and off planes and they're on cell phones and websites and.
Well, also English people, as we all know from our reading, have a very, very certainly had a very, very rigid class system, and it's not just between the upper and the next to upper class. It goes all the way down. So. We had next door neighbors who were also British, but my parents wanted nothing to do with them because their accent wasn't quite right, and so on. So it's being English is its own isolation in a way.
My Fair Lady is actually no joke, is it? In terms of, and speech is probably the most visible key in a lot of ways, as well as dress maybe and other things. But I think that British people were extremely good at pigeonholing by speech patterns where people belonged. I've always remembered riding down a bus in London, on top of one of those red-decker buses, and I'd had a free day in London. The night before, I had thought as I was strolling down Piccadilly that I would like to go to the Ritz for tea. So the only question that crossed my mind was whether I really wanted to pay whatever the outrageous price for tea would be. So I thought, well, I'll skip dinner. I'm on my own, so I went into the hotel and booked a table, and it was all very cordial, and away I went. So that's what I'm going to do when I'm through with the bus ride, and as I'm riding down Piccadilly, there's this little retired British gentleman doing a commentary for the passengers on top of the bus. And I still remember him looking up, and he's saying, now ahead of us, I can't do the accent, ahead of us, ladies and gentlemen, he said, is the famous Ritz Hotel. And he said, posh people, not the likes of you or me, will go there for tea.
Right.
And I was just, I couldn't, I really could hardly get my mind around the idea that for me, what was 100% a financial decision, for him was an unbridgeable gulf. I mean, if I had said to him, well, I have a table booked at 4, and would you like to join me for tea, he would actually not have felt he could do that.
Yeah.
He would have felt unwelcome, and they would have made it clear to him.
Out of place, yeah.
Yeah, but they would have made it clear to him, not only would he have felt out of place, but they would have made it absolutely clear to him that he didn't belong there. But because I was an American, none of those rules counted.
Mm-hmm. In a way, the American and Canadian class system is much more secretive. It's there, but it's much more hidden. In England you have the royals, of course, and all the people connected to them, and the very famous public schools, which here would be called private schools, where they go, and that separates people tremendously. I mean, the accent, aside from being posh, which is one thing, the other thing is being Oxbridge, having an Oxbridge accent. I mean, everybody knows those accents, and people who go there acquire them very, very rapidly, with suspicious speed, actually, because they open doors for you.
You bet. I think our system is slightly more fluid in that education or money can grease your progress up and down a bit. Money, but education can too.
Yeah, that's true.
And in fact, I think that's one of the real sad things that you often read about, especially in British fiction, is that people can educate themselves out of any place that they can be comfortable, because they can't really belong to the up-level group.
Although I don't know if there are any poor knights. There's Sir Elton John and Sir Paul McCartney, but is there Sir so-and-so who makes $30,000 a year or something, or $20,000 a year?
Good point. Well, the other thing that I noticed that made you feel a bit of an outsider in this English enclave is you said your family was Catholic?
Oh, well, just because that's not an outsider thing in Canada, because Canada is a very Catholic country. But it's unusual for English people to be Catholic. So the other English people that we've met, and there are a lot of English immigrants up there, much more so than, say, in New York, they're kind of a bit taken aback that you'd be English and Catholic.
So, as a child, it gave you kind of a different lens to look at your community?
Yeah, I always felt a bit strange, not quite like that we were real Canadians somehow. It's an odd sort of thing. It didn't feel bad per se, just a bit unusual. And yes, I mean, I could certainly hear the Canadian accents and turns of phrase more vividly than people who didn't have a different accent and turn of phrase at home.
And then you moved off to New York.
Right, now there's a place with accents. Yes, and living there too, you come back, when I'd come back for Christmas or something, the longer I lived there, the more Canadian all my old friends would sound. When I talked to them on the phone, it would sound, they really do say "a" all the time. And they really do say "out and about." It's very funny.
You can very much hear it. Louise Penny, who's recently made a fair amount of noise with her debut novel, Still Life. She has a lovely,
She has a beautiful, I would call that a CBC voice.
Right.
Which it was. She was a CBC commentator for years.
But nevertheless, definitely Canadian. There's it's different. When I left the Midwest,
that's Canadian accent at its most charming, I think.
Well, that's a really good point. I can still remember when I was a kid and went from Chicago to Palo Alto, people used to say to me things like, say car. Because you could do that flat Midwestern A, and everybody in California, which was sort of the melting pot for language, would laugh hysterically. Made you feel like a real rube. Right. Well, why were you in New York? Did you have some career, do I remember this right, in script writing, screenwriting?
Yes. I was like the guy in Casablanca who goes there for the waters. I went to New York for the screenplays. And of course, they're actually all in Los Angeles. If you want to make a living as a screenwriter, don't move to New York. It's not a place to make a living doing that.